Welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 4, Introduction to Monopoly. In this lesson, we'll just set up the concept and we'll look at how a monopolist figures its marginal revenue. Very different way than how it's done with a perfect competitor. As we said in class, monopoly is the opposite extreme of the spectrum of market structures from perfect competition. And the example they gave in your book was of the firm De Beers, the diamond firm. That's a good, it's probably the best historical example of this. Going back 100 years, De Beers had over 95% share of the diamond production industry. Today it's quite a bit less, as you see from this graph. They're still the main player, but 62% of the industry about 10 years ago. In any case, if you've ever seen one of these ads, the Diamond is Forever slogan and campaign was coined by De Beers. And looking at that ad, you might wonder what is being advertised there. What company is that? Well, it is De Beers, and the idea is that if you promote diamonds in general, then that benefits De Beers. So De Beers, by doing that, is trying to just increase overall demand for diamonds, which is done very successfully. But the other thing that De Beers has done over the years is classic behavior of a monopolist, which is by raising the price of diamonds above what the competitive level would be, basically by holding back production and by kind of unnaturally making it scarce. This is true of diamonds and a number of other materials, but the diamonds are the classic example. So a monopoly has complete market power, has the ability to set price however it wants, and will set it above the competitive price, kind of obvious. And the reason that monopolies are able to exist is if there's some sort of large barrier to entry. And for a pure monopoly, it needs to be a complete barrier to entry that keeps other firms from coming in and competing with it and driving the price down. So the book lays out 4 different types of barriers to entry. The control of scarce resources, the first one I note there, is what we would consider, how we would classify the De Beers monopoly that had control of the large majority of diamond mines in South Africa, which had gained through colonialism in the late 19th century, and then just kind of maintain that for a large extent over time, although it's less today. But there are other things that can create monopolies. Large economies of scale. Remember, that means as you increase production, then your costs per unit decrease. So we'll look at, those are called natural monopolies. We'll look at that later this chapter. The idea of technological superiority, which can be, I think, very fleeting. Your book uses the example of Intel chips, which, again, that can be the case for a short amount of time, but as you always see, that goes away sooner or later as innovation happens. And then government-created barriers, which include patents, copyrights, things that the government puts in place as an incentive for firms to innovate and produce, so they can put in the big upfront costs so that they can have large profits early on, so they can have an incentive to do that. Anyway, we'll talk more about all those examples in class. So what a monopoly does in terms of its practice and how you can see it on the graph is we've got a comparison here, just a regular supply and demand curve. The C here, point PC, is the competitive price and quantity. So for if this market, say this is the market for diamonds, what this graph is saying is if the market were perfectly competitive, then the quantity of diamonds would be QC here, and the price of diamonds would be PC here. Versus if this is a monopoly, then what the monopolist does is hold back production, decrease production to QM, which is lower than QC, and increase the price to PM. So it's very intuitive that a monopoly would sell at a higher price than a competitive market, but it's not as obvious. It's important to remember that a monopoly actually sells at a lower quantity than a competitive market would. Sometimes we assume that a monopolist is going to sell a huge amount, as much as possible, and they're going to sell a large amount as a single firm. They're the whole market. But compared to if an entire market was competitive with many firms in there selling even just a little bit each, the overall quantity is less of that good that will be sold by a monopoly compared to a perfectly competitive firm. So perfectly competitive market. So we're not going to have a monopolist supply curve. The monopolist is going to pick a point that maximizes their profit and sell it at that point along the demand curve, as shown here. Okay, that's kind of the big picture view. Now we're going to get let's do one more comparison, kind of big picture, to perfectly competitive markets. Remember that the demand curve of a perfectly competitive firm, since they can sell all they want at the market price, whether they sell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they can charge that same market price. Because for a perfectly competitive firm, for a tomato grower, they're such a small part of the market that increasing their quantity from 1 to 5 bushels is not going to affect the market price of tomatoes. They don't need to drop the price to get more people to buy it. Whereas for a monopolist, if they want to sell, now these quantities have to be a lot bigger. Let's call it 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. If a monopolist is the entire market, then to increase their output, to increase their production, they have to drop the price. Because they can basically sell what the demand curve says they can sell at different prices. So in a sense, it almost seems like the monopolist is at a disadvantage. Really, they're not, because these quantities are so much larger than these quantities. So putting these graphs next to each other, they're not at all to scale. Obviously, the monopolist is going to be a lot better off in terms of profits. But the one thing they have to deal with is that they have a downward sloping demand curve, whereas the perfect competitor has a perfectly elastic demand curve. Elastic. We learned that last chapter. Now we're going to use the term, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, and that becomes significant in their marginal revenue. So let's turn to look at that now. Here's the table from your book, hypothetical of, I think they say this is De Beers, the price of, if they sell diamonds at this price, then here's the quantity of diamonds that's going to be bought. So this here represents the demand curve for diamonds. Price and quantity demanded. And as we expect from the demand curve, following the law of demand, at higher prices, lower quantities of diamonds are demanded. If they drop the price way down to 250, 200, 150, then much larger quantities of diamonds are going to be demanded. Because they're probably going to be in the thousands or even millions of diamonds demanded, right? Okay, so here's what we do to find the marginal revenue. We've already learned that marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue over the change in quantity of output. So we just find the total revenue, this third column here, of each possible level of production. We think of these as all possible choices for this firm, and they're just going to choose the one that maximizes their profit. So this column calculates the total revenue, just the price times the quantity at each level of output. And then the marginal revenue is simply the change in total revenue. And since our change in quantity is 1 each time, we can forget about that for this calculation. So the marginal revenue is just the change in total revenue from one quantity to the next. So let's focus in on this column now, the marginal revenue column. Remember again, with the perfect competitor, the marginal revenue was constant, perfectly elastic. Now here's this downward sloping marginal revenue line. If we were to graph it, we'd have the quantity of output on the x-axis and the marginal revenue on the y-axis. It's going to be downward sloping. It's also going to cross and become negative here. So it would look something like this. Now let's put that together with the demand curve. If we were to graph the marginal revenue line and the demand curve together, this is the same data from the table above, it looks like this. You should get very used to drawing this shape for a monopolist. Here's the demand, here's the marginal revenue. So several significant, interesting things going on with the relationship between these two lines here, the demand and the marginal revenue. First is that the marginal revenue is always below the demand curve. Marginal revenue is below the demand curve. And the other thing that that means is that the marginal revenue from producing an additional unit is less than the price of that unit. In other words, if the firm is currently producing 6 units of output and wants to produce more, it wants to expand and produce 7 units of output, it needs to drop the price to $650. But it's not going to make an additional $650 from doing that. It's going to make only an additional $350 because it's got to drop the price to $650 of all the first 6 units, where it was currently selling at $700. Now it's got to sell them all at the new price of $650. We're assuming this is what's called a single price monopolist. Which means that they charge the same price for every unit. So they can either charge $700 for 6 or $650 for 7. They've got to charge the same amount for every unit they sell. That's what makes the marginal revenue less than the price of the good. Again, they want to expand to 6 to 7. The price of the 7 when they charge 7, when they sell 7 is $650, but the marginal revenue is only $350 because they're only increasing the revenue from $4,200 to $4,550 since they had to drop the price in effect of these first 6 units. Okay, so for monopolists, the marginal revenue is always below the demand curve, and it's always less than the price of the good at whatever output level they choose. Okay, another thing to notice going on here is that when marginal revenue is positive, when it's above 0 here, so from 0 to, in this graph, 10, as quantity increases, then the total revenue is increasing because marginal revenue is positive. To increase the quantity, remember we have to decrease the price. Remember what we know about this, if this relationship is the case, if you decrease price, you increase total revenue. That means that you have elastic demand. So in this data, from 0 to 10, from 0 to the point at which the marginal revenue hits 0, then you're going to have an elastic demand curve. That's going to be the midpoint of that demand curve. Just mathematically is how it's always going to work out. So let me mark it out on here. From there to there, that's the elastic portion of the demand curve. That means from here to here, now that marginal revenue is negative, that's the inelastic portion of the demand curve. We could work that out the same way. From 10 to 20, as quantity increases and price decreases, now total revenue is decreasing. Marginal revenue being negative means that you're kind of pulling down your total revenue. So that means you have inelastic demand in that portion of the demand curve. That's basically what this graph down here shows. This is a graph of the total revenue as the firm increases production. First, its revenue is increasing from 0 all the way to 10, and then it starts to decrease. And if they try to sell 20 diamonds, they've got to price them at 0, so they're going to make 0 revenue, which they obviously wouldn't do. Anyway, this is again showing the elastic portion of the demand curve and the inelastic portion, how that's related to the marginal revenue. That's going to be really useful as we look at how a monopolist maximizes profit and chooses its quantity and price. Okay, so these are the key things to start us off with. Again, in review, you need to understand why the monopolist's marginal revenue curve is the way that it is, how it's related to the demand curve, and how that relates to the elasticity of its demand curve. Be able to note that at this midpoint, where marginal revenue hits 0 is going to be the midpoint of the demand curve. Above that is going to be elastic, and below that is going to be inelastic. It's a tricky concept, one that becomes really useful, so we'll do a bunch of practice with it. See you in class.